Hi, biologists. Good morning. This lecture is going to cover biomolecules, and we've already talked about these a little bit. You've done a little exploring on your own, and today we're going to use all of the information that you already know to kind of pull everything together and really make sure we understand the biomolecules. And the word biomolecule is pretty easy to figure out because this part means life, and this means molecule or group of atoms together. And so these are the atoms of life that help us function. Um, when we talk about the biomolecules, one of the synonyms that we can use for biomolecules is this word that you see here, macromolecule. That means the same thing as biomolecule, and I will use them interchangeably, but the prefix here means big. So big molecules that our body needs. Now there are 4 groups that we're going to be taking notes on today, and you have a good page to take notes in your workbook, or you'll notice that I have attached a digital document for you to type on. Either one is acceptable. When you're finished with this assignment, you're going to take a picture or submit the digital copy to me in our Google Classroom. If you're going to take notes in your workbook, you can turn to page 107, and there are 4 little squares inside that page for you to take notes on. So let's first talk about those 4 macromolecules and just identify them. And you've already done this, so not too surprising, you're going to know what these are. There are carbohydrates, nucleic acids, lipids, and proteins. So those are all of the macromolecules or biomolecules that we'll be talking about. And if you look below here, I've got all 4 of them. Before I tell you the answers, why don't you pause this video and see if you can guess which of the structures represents which of the molecules, knowing what you know about them already. So hit pause and take a guess. All right, let's see if you are right. A is our smallest biomolecule on this sheet, and it is ring-shaped, and we know that carbohydrates are always ring-shaped. So this is a picture of a carbohydrate. The next one I thought you might be able to get is this big one over here. This one looks like a double helix or a ladder that's twisted around itself, and that's actually a picture of DNA, which is a nucleic acid. The last 2 are a little trickier, although this one I was hoping you could identify. This one, notice, has 3 really big chains that come off of it, attached to this sort of smaller unit right here. This is a lipid, and we'll talk about lipids in a little while. And the last one, of course, is a protein. And to be honest, proteins just kind of look like big blobs. Okay. So before we really talk about the characteristics of those molecules, I want to talk a little bit about monomers and polymers. You watched some videos about monomers and polymers, so you already probably know what they are. But just so that you have these in your notes, and you can put these at the top of page 107 or wherever they fit, a monomer is what we call a single building block. When I'm thinking about Legos, that's a 1-by-1 Lego. That's a tiny little Lego. And then a polymer is when you take lots of these little tiny monomers and you glue them together into something bigger. We call that a polymer. And so instead of a 1-by-1 block, maybe it's a 1-by-12 Lego, and all those little 1-by-1s are glued together. In our bodies, we will often make polymers out of monomers, or we will take a polymer and break it down into its monomers. So lots of different strategies can happen with those 2 things. You'll need to know those definitions. They're definitely on your exam, so make sure you put a star next to both of those. Okay, so the macromolecules that we already mentioned have both polymers and monomers that you're going to need to identify. And what I would do is in each of your 4 squares on your notes, I would go ahead and write down, for example, in the carbohydrate square, I would write that the polymer is a polysaccharide and that the monomer is a monosaccharide. And we need to be able to identify the polymer and the monomer in each of these 4 macromolecule groups. So I'll start again here at the beginning. A carbohydrate, which we know is a sugar, can either be a monomer or it can be a polymer. If it's a monomer, it's a monosaccharide, and that prefix mono means one. So a monomer for carbohydrate is just a single sugar, and we'll talk about some examples of those, but one example is glucose. That's a single sugar. The polymer for carbohydrate is a polysaccharide, and the word saccharide means sugar, and the word poly means many. So many sugars put together is going to be the polymer of carbohydrate. Lipids have a monomer and a polymer as well. For lipids, we can consider each individual fatty acid or a glycerol the monomer of lipid, and when we put them all together to make the polymer, we get a triglyceride, which is a 3-chain fat, and that comes from the 3 fatty acids, and we'll look at some pictures of those. For proteins, the monomer is called an amino acid, and we'll talk about those in a little while. And when we put a bunch of amino acids together, they make a polypeptide or a many protein. Peptide is a synonym for protein. And the last one are the nucleic acids. And if we look at the single building blocks of nucleic acids, there's something called a nucleotide. And when we put them all together, they make DNA or RNA. So we've talked about monomers and polymers, and you've seen this already in your PBL, your pizza gone missing PBL. But how are polymers made? Typically, a polymer is made through what's called a dehydration reaction. And what happens in a dehydration reaction is we take 2 smaller molecules and we remove a water molecule, and it opens up bonding sites that allow those 2 simple molecules to bind together. And that's this picture down here. You'll notice these 2 smaller sugar molecules. One of them loses a hydrogen, one of them loses an OH group. That makes a water molecule, which is what comes off. And then what we're left with is this bigger polymer over here. So that's how we make these polymers. And our bodies will do that if we need polymers. But we'll also take polymers and break them down. So if we had to take water out to put monomers together, what do you think we have to add to break a polymer apart? If you answered water, that's absolutely right. The process of taking a big molecule, a polymer, and breaking it down, we might also call this digestion, is called hydrolysis. The lysis part means to break, and hydro means with water. So we're breaking something with water, and the way that we do that is we add water back in to a polymer. It breaks the bond between the monomers, and we have simple little molecules floating around that our bodies can digest. Okay, we're going to talk about each group of macromolecules separately now. We're going to start with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates has the most information on it, so you may need to write kind of small in your boxes. But some things you need to know about carbohydrates. Number 1, you need to know what they do. This is really important, so put this in your notes and put a star next to it. Carbohydrates are the immediate energy that all organisms use. And we've talked about, and we did this in our food burning lab, how do we measure that energy? We measure it in calories, which is the amount of heat that's produced by the food as it's burned, and how much it raises 1 gram of water, essentially. And what we find in carbohydrates is that there's essentially 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate. So this is great immediate energy for organisms. The other thing that we can do with the carbohydrates is we can store the carbohydrates, and those carbohydrates can start building the structure for plants, some animals, and fungus. And when I talk about structure, I'm talking about the physical characteristics that we see in these organisms. So we already mentioned that the monomer of carbohydrate is a monosaccharide. It's a single sugar. There are 3 single sugars. You do not need to know all of these, but you do need to know this one. That's the most important one. So glucose is a monosaccharide. It's ring-shaped, and all carbohydrates are ring-shaped. Its formula for glucose is C6H12O6. That's also the same formula for fructose. You might remember that from when we talked about this in your PBL. This is super important. We use them for the immediate release of energy. And then I want you to put a huge star next to this. One way that we can recognize a carbohydrate is that they're found in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Always, 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 always. So whatever the numbers are in this formula, they will always be 1 carbon to every 2 hydrogens to every 1 oxygen. So the simplest carbohydrate that could ever exist, hypothetically, would be 1 carbon, 2 hydrogens, and 1 oxygen. So they always occur in this 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Now, sometimes we have sugars that are a little more complex than monosaccharides, but not as complex as maybe a polymer would be. And that example is a disaccharide. The prefix di means two. So these are technically 2 sugars that are linked together, or we call them double sugars. The one that you should know is sucrose, that's table sugar. Or if you think back to our enzyme lab that we did, lactose was a disaccharide that broke down into glucose. I'm just going to put gluc. And it also broke down into another monosaccharide called galactose. And so if we put those two together, they're going to make this lactose sugar. Again, they're going to provide energy. It's really short term. And if you look at the structure, they always have rings. All carbohydrates have these ring structures. So that's really important. Make sure you have that in your notes. Okay, so we've talked about the monomer. We talked about these disaccharides that are kind of in the middle. And the last thing I want to mention are these polysaccharides. This is the polymer of carbohydrate. These are many sugars, all linked together. Now, the functions of these more complicated carbohydrates are a little bit different. Sometimes we could store energy. In plants, we store these carbohydrates as starch. That's what you eat when you eat a potato or a yam. In animals, we store that extra carbohydrate as glycogen. And we store that so that we can keep enough sugar in our bloodstream. And sometimes we'll break those carbohydrates back down, or sometimes we'll store extra carbohydrate that way. In organisms, we can also use polymers of carbohydrate to help build the structure. And this is especially true in plants. Cellulose is the carbohydrate that makes plants rigid and they grow upright. And that's what, when you break celery and it crunches, that's cellulose. That's a really big, long carbohydrate. In some animals, we can use carbohydrate to build what's called chitin. That's one of the components in an exoskeleton of an insect, for example. So carbohydrates can both give us energy and also help provide sort of the structure for some cells. Okay, so really quick check-in here. Let's pretend that your friend has diabetes and you notice that her blood sugar is dropping. You think she could pass out soon. If you want her to get immediate energy that will help her bloodstream recover, what kind of a carb are you going to give her? Are you going to give her a monosaccharide or are you going to give her a polysaccharide? If you answered monosaccharide, you're absolutely right. And this is because your body doesn't have to digest these. They can just easily be absorbed into your bloodstream. So something that has very simple sugars in it. A good example might be fruit juice or simple candies that have simple sugars in them. Okay, let's pretend also that you're really hungry and you feel really lousy by the time it's lunchtime, which since I'm eating lunch at 2, this is true every day. If you want to make yourself feel better by the time you get to lunch, what could you do to adjust the carbohydrates in your breakfast to make it through to lunch? If you answered eat more complex carbohydrates or polysaccharides, that would be absolutely true. And this is because your body takes longer to digest them. These are really big, long chains of sugar. So when you eat them, your body's going to slowly break those bonds down through that hydrolysis cycle or reaction that we talked about. So the more polysaccharides you eat, the better you're going to feel if you have to go a long time in between meals as your body slowly digests those. All right, we're going to switch gears. I want you to move to your lipid box. Lipids is our second macromolecule or biomolecule that we're going to talk about. You need to write down the monomer and the polymer if you have not already. The monomer, remember, is either a glycerol or a single fatty acid. And the polymer is when we take 3 of these fatty acids and we combine them with 1 of this glycerol and we get what's called a triglyceride. So 3 fatty acids and a glycerol. And if you look down here, these long chains right here are the 3 individual fatty acids, and you can see them there. And this part right here is the glycerol. And when we link them all together, we have this triglyceride. These are made of carbon and hydrogen. I don't have a ratio for you, but usually they're really long chains of carbon and hydrogen. Some characteristics of lipids: they don't dissolve in water. Some examples would be fats, oils, waxes, and steroids are a group of hormones that are made from lipids. Okay, so what do? This is important. I want you to write this down. Fats store energy for our bodies. There's over twice as much energy in a fat as there are in carbs. And if you think back to our food burning lab, the marshmallow was a carbohydrate and the Frito was our lipid. When you lit the Frito, it had a really big flame, and that's because it has twice as much energy as a single carbohydrate, with 9 calories per gram. That's a lot of energy in fats. If you were going to go hike a mountain and you wanted to pack a really light backpack, one thing that mountaineers will always pack with them are a really sufficient supply of foods that have fats in them. And that's because they provide more energy than carbohydrates per gram. So you can pack more of them and your bag will be lighter. Some mountaineers will take things like sticks of butter and actually eat them as they're climbing, like Mount Kilimanjaro or Everest. And they'll melt that butter in their hot cocoa, or they'll roll it in cinnamon and sugar and eat it like a candy bar. And it's simply because of the energy that you can get from a lipid. The other thing that lipids are used for is that they form our cell membranes, which are the boundaries around our cell. And if you look at this picture right here, these little blue dots with the 2 tails are actually lipids, so fats. They're used as a waterproof covering. They insulate, they pad our organs. And again, they're used as these hormone messengers that send messages in our body. So things like cholesterol, testosterone, estrogen, those are all lipid-based. And those messages are pretty important. So we use lipids all the time. It's important to have some of those in your diet. Okay, so one of the things that we looked at in our PBL is the difference between saturated and unsaturated fats. Saturated fats have only single bonds. So if you look down here, a single line right here is a single bond, versus unsaturated fats will have these double bonds in them. And what happens with these saturated fats is we say they're saturated with hydrogen. They have a lot more hydrogens because if there's not a double bond, you can have 2 extra hydrogens in that location. These fats are always going to be solid at room temperature. So things like butter and Crisco and lard, those are all saturated fats. Unsaturated fats don't have as many hydrogen atoms because of the double bond that can happen. And as a result, they have hydrogens that don't get tangled in each other to make a solid, and instead they kind of slide past each other. So these are all your oils. So like your olive oils, your vegetable oils, your canola oils, all of those are going to be unsaturated fats. So when you're looking at the back of a food label, you can see how many saturated versus unsaturated fats there are. Which one do you think gives you more energy? If energy comes from carbon-hydrogen bonds, would saturated fats or unsaturated fats actually give you more energy? If you answered saturated fats, you're absolutely right. And that's why a lot of diets will have you using oils as opposed to solid fats in your recipes. Okay, we're going to switch gears again. I want you to move over to the box that says nucleic acids in your notes. Nucleic acids are our third biomolecule, and they house the genetic material in each of your cells. The monomer of them is nucleic acid, and the polymer is DNA or RNA. You need to know that nucleic acids are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Now remember, carbohydrates were made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Lipids were made from mostly carbon and hydrogen. And now we've added these other elements in nucleic acids. So we've got this nitrogen and this phosphorus. This is a picture of what our DNA or RNA kind of looks like. DNA is double-stranded, RNA is single-stranded. And we'll talk about those when we talk about cell processes later. The monomer, the nucleotide that is the monomer, the building block, is kind of special. There's a picture down here of what this nucleotide looks like. It's made up of a sugar, a 5-carbon sugar, and that's right here. You can see its ring structure. It's made up of what we call a nitrogenous base, which is in the middle right here. And then it also has this phosphate group out on the side. So it's made up of 3 things: a sugar, a nitrogenous base, and a phosphate group. And the nitrogenous base goes in the middle, the sugar hangs out on the side, and the phosphate hangs out on the side. So this piece right here is a nucleotide. And if we link a whole bunch of nucleotides together, we're going to form this DNA double helix, which you see here. Nucleotides have the function of just storing and transmitting hereditary information. This is where the instructions for each of your cells come from. And we'll spend a lot more time talking about DNA in another unit. All right, our last one for today are proteins. Now, we've already talked about proteins. We've done a couple of labs with proteins. But just to reiterate, the monomer of a protein is an amino acid. And there's a picture over here of an amino acid. There are essentially 20 different amino acids that all look a little bit different. They link together to form a protein or a polypeptide. And these polypeptides have all kinds of functions in our bodies, which we'll talk about. The elements for most proteins are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and sometimes sulfur. When you burn your hair, which is made of protein, it has that crazy smell because of the sulfur inside that protein. So, functions of proteins, you already know these, but we're going to go over them again. Proteins can be used for the structural components of some of our body. So they will support and strengthen all kinds of, molecules in our body, our hair, our skin, our nails. To some extent, the proteins make up our muscles in our bodies. So they really are in charge of giving our bodies the structure or the shape that we have. But the other function of proteins that we've already spent some time on is these functional processes. And the one that I want you to write down here is that proteins are also enzymes. Remember that enzymes are these molecules that speed up chemical reactions by lowering the energy it takes to start them. So this is really important. They help transport molecules. They regulate every single body function that you have. They're involved in hormone transmission. But these proteins are probably the most important macromolecule when it comes to your body functioning the way that it should. And we've already talked about enzymes, but if you need a refresher, you could go back and look at our enzyme notes, which are found a little bit later in your workbook. I think they are kind of near the end of this unit. So you can flip backwards and see if you can find those enzyme notes. Oh, page 121, if you need a refresher on enzymes, because you will need to know those as well. Okay, the last thing I want you to do is flip to page 108, or the next page, and there is what looks like sort of a graphic organizer that has a picture of each of the macromolecules, and then I ask you to name them. So you're going to put the 4 names: carbohydrate, lipid, nucleic acid, or protein, and match them up based on what they look like. There's a spot for you to write down the monomer and the polymer. the elements that compose it, and the functions and uses. And I would like you to summarize your notes in that table, in that summary table. And then down at the bottom, it asks for you to go ahead and define a dehydration reaction and a hydrolysis reaction. So if you need to go back to the beginning of our notes to get those put in there, that would be great. And then the last thing it has there is this free response question. And I'd like you to try to answer that free response question as well. I need copies of all three of these things, so you can either do them digitally or you can take pictures and post them to this assignment. And then don't forget, when you're finished with all of these notes, the last thing that you're going to do is to take the quiz that I have posted over this material, and you are welcome to use your notes on that quiz. So go ahead and take the quiz when you're done with all of this, and that's your only homework for over your Thanksgiving time off. I hope everybody's doing well, and I will see you next week.